Among a lot of conservative American Christian parents, there is a specific, deeply rooted fear about sending their beloved children off to university for the first time. The Gospel Coalition, which stands as one of the biggest and most influential evangelical websites in the United States, frequently addresses what it calls one of Christian parents' absolute greatest fears: the structural worry that the secular university environment will actively lead their kids away from the faith of their childhood. Now, sometimes that sharp fear is directed toward the cliché of an overly aggressive, secular philosophy professor looking to dismantle a student's worldview on day one. But, just as often, this deep anxiety points directly at the potential new friends the kid might meet on campus. It is the persistent worry that entering a brand new, purely secular friend circle will slowly, systematically talk them out of their religious faith. Recently, an advanced sociological study set out to rigorously test this exact cultural story. The researchers asked a fundamental question. If you fill a teenage believer's closest friendship network almost entirely with non-religious friends, does that young person eventually lose their religion? And the scientific answer they found was often yes, but notably only to a certain extent. To truly understand the mechanics of this study, you have to start with the foundational work of a brilliant scholar named Peter Berger. He was widely recognized as one of the most important and influential sociologists of religion in the entire 20th century. Back in the year 1967, Berger wrote a landmark, highly influential book titled The Sacred Canopy. Berger's basic underlying idea in this text is that human beings are constantly creating social worlds. We construct complex cultures, legal institutions, systems of laws, social customs, and sacred texts over generations. And then, as new generations are born, people come to automatically experience those human-made worlds as an objective, unchangeable reality. We end up taking our highly specific social worlds completely for granted, as if they were natural laws. But Berger critically pointed out that there is no natural law of physics that says you must get married in a specific way, or bury the dead according to a particular ritual, or respect the authority of a political monarch. Because of this, Berger argued that these social arrangements are inherently fragile, precisely because they are socially constructed. Especially in profound moments of existential crisis like sudden death, intense human suffering, and deep systemic injustice, a person could always look at society and just ask, well, what is the point of any of this? This is exactly where religion enters the sociological framework. Religion plays a crucial, stabilizing role in our socially constructed reality by anchoring our fragile, human-made order into something viewed as cosmic, sacred, and entirely unquestionable. Under this view, marriage is no longer just a convenient local custom. It mirrors a sacred institution instituted directly by God from the beginning of time. The king does not rule simply because he is a particularly persuasive or powerful guy. He rules by absolute divine appointment. Once you successfully connect a society's practical rules to the gods, the sacred, or the deep structure of reality itself, those rules instantly transform into an objective reality in the minds of the population. To describe this grand phenomenon, Berger famously used the elegant metaphor of a sacred canopy, the overarching, all-encompassing religious framework stretching over an entire society, providing clear, comforting answers to fundamental existential questions like, why are we here? Why do terrible things happen to perfectly good people? Why should our society be organized in this specific hierarchical way? And what exactly happens to our consciousness after we die? Under that massive, unified, sacred canopy, your immediate family believes the worldview, your neighbors believe it, and maybe even your worst enemies believe it. Everywhere you look in your daily life, your worldview is constantly confirmed by others, and doubting that worldview would feel just as weird and impossible as doubting that the sun will rise tomorrow morning. In other words, a strong sacred canopy makes a society's social order and spiritual worldview feel completely obvious, natural, and unquestionable. The book became famous in the academic world in part because Berger predicted that the onset of modern era would drastically weaken these protective canopies. He argued that rapid scientific advancement, massive religious pluralism, intense urbanization, and the rise of purely secular institutions would inevitably expose ordinary people to multiple, competing worldviews simultaneously. And once you suddenly realize that your specific sacred canopy is just one canopy among many other different canopy choices in the world, its absolute, taken for granted quality becomes significantly harder to maintain. The sociological plausibility structure supporting your entire faith system weakens dramatically. Interestingly, as the decades rolled on, Peter Berger later revised some of his original, sweeping views on secularization. He came to honestly believe that the modern world had not secularized nearly as much as many mid-century sociologists had confidently predicted. Instead of religion completely disappearing from human life, the modern era often produced a crowded, highly competitive marketplace of multiple competing sacred canopies. Because of this shift, later sociologists decided to shrink Berger's massive idea down to analyze more localized, miniature plausibility structures. For instance, the prominent scholar Christian Smith cleverly called these smaller microenvironments sacred umbrellas, while the sociologist James Wellman beautifully referred to them as sacred tents. These are smaller-scale sacred canopies that exist specifically over close friendships, tight-knit youth groups, or immediate family networks, rather than a giant, singular canopy stretching over all of a massive society. The core idea here is that your spiritual worldview does not actually need the entire world to agree with you in order to remain highly plausible to your brain. You just need your closest friends and your immediate family members to agree with you. As long as you are standing securely under your shared sacred umbrella with those closest to you, believing in the exact same theological doctrines, you stay completely dry. The localized plausibility structure supporting your worldview remains incredibly strong. But this raises a fascinating question. What happens if even one close friend standing under your sacred umbrella does not share the same worldview? In the year 2019, two dedicated researchers, Matthew Fasciane and Matthew Brashears, set out to scientifically test this exact scenario. They carefully pulled extensive data from the General Social Survey, which specifically asked respondents to name their closest, most important personal contacts. The survey then tracked the exact religion and political party of each named contact, allowing the researchers to see for any given individual how many of their close ties actually agreed with them on core ideologies. And then, the researchers drew a hard, analytical line. If every single close contact in your network perfectly matched your specific religion or your political party, you were classified as having a sealed umbrella. If even one single close contact did not match, you were classified as having a hole in your umbrella. They put the conclusion plainly in their paper. Total agreement with the people close to you acts as a powerful, near-impenetrable shield against doubt. But even a single close associate with a different ideology creates an immediate hole in one's sacred umbrella. And this umbrella theory held up remarkably well across the data. Christians, whose close circle was entirely Christian, held significantly tighter to their orthodox beliefs. And, interestingly, it was not just limited to religion. Democrats who were surrounded only by fellow Democrats were far more certain that the government should expand its funding for social services. Meanwhile, Republicans who were surrounded only by fellow Republicans were far more set against taxing the wealthy. A completely sealed circle of any kind, whether political or religious, successfully kept cognitive doubt at bay. But it is vital to note that Fasciane and Brashears were just studying how tightly people held onto their beliefs at a single moment, not whether people actually changed their minds over time. The researchers took a single snapshot in time and found that a sealed umbrella correlates with firmer belief. But they did not actually watch anyone go through the process of leaving their faith. So, the next obvious sociological question is, if a leaky sacred umbrella weakens your grip on your beliefs, can it actually make you let go of them entirely? In other words, can we successfully predict who completely loses their religion based purely on how many non-religious friends are actively present in someone's friendship network? That is exactly what scholars Katie Corcoran and Christopher Scheitel set out to do in their rigorous 2015 study. Now, answering a dynamic question like this is incredibly tough for sociologists. Most traditional surveys take a single snapshot. They ask people, right now, do you believe in God? And then right now, who are your friends? And then they notice the unsurprising fact that atheists tend to have a lot of non-religious friends, and Christians tend to have a lot of Christian friends. That is not exactly a groundbreaking observation. A single snapshot cannot tell you which variable came first. Did the secular friends actively make the person an atheist? Or did the person become an atheist on their own and then go out into the world to find new friends who agreed with them? Sociologists call this the critical difference between influence and selection. Influence is your friends changing you, and selection is you actively choosing friends who already match your internal views. From a single snapshot survey, the two processes look completely identical. The researchers successfully got around this massive problem by using a unique dataset that followed the exact same group of people over an 8-year period, called the National Study of Youth and Religion. They studied each individual twice, once as a teenager back in 2005, and again as a grown adult in 2013. And both times they asked the exact same question: do you believe in God? The options were flatly yes, no, or unsure. To count as genuinely becoming an atheist in this study, a participant had to say yes or unsure as a teenager, and then switch to a flat, definitive no as an adult. Then, the researchers looked closely at who that teenager's friends were back in 2005. Each teenager named their 5 closest friends and specified how many of them were not religious. They also asked how many of those friends were involved in a religious youth group, the exact kind of peer who would reinforce the structural strength of the sacred umbrella. Now, one critical thing to keep in mind here is what the word religion actually means within the context of this specific study, which is a common thing I see often under-theorized in these sociological studies. The survey sample was overwhelmingly Christian, and the study measured belief using a single, blunt question: do you believe in God? That question fits a Christian, Jewish, or Muslim theological frame very neatly, but it fits far less so for other complex religious traditions. The same limitation goes for the other question, which focused heavily on being in a youth group, a pretty distinctly Protestant way to do Christianity in the United States. It is also highly up for debate among scholars whether a propositional belief in God is even the right criterion for defining religion in the first place. A lot of global traditions do not organize themselves around a propositional belief claim the way Protestant Christianity does. So, when this study states that someone became an atheist between 2005 and 2013, what it is really tracking is a young person who walked away from a roughly Christian-shaped Western belief in God. And since that represents most of the American religious landscape, it is still a real and incredibly useful thing to measure. But just keep in mind these findings are narrower than what the grand word religion might sound like on the surface. With those important caveats in mind, let us look at the actual results. The study did heavily corroborate the hole in the umbrella finding from the 2019 study. Every single way the researchers measured it, having more non-religious friends in your network meant significantly higher statistical odds of becoming an atheist. Take, for example, a religious teenager with 0 non-religious friends, where everyone in their close circle believes. According to the data, their predicted chance of becoming an atheist over those 8 years is very small, about 3%. Now, take a religious teenager whose entire friend group is completely non-religious. Their predicted chance jumps from that small 3% up to 14%. So, going from a perfectly sealed umbrella to one full of secular holes more than quadruples the statistical odds. Even having just one non-religious friend in a massive friendship network of believers nudges the odds up. The authors argue this occurs because even one friend can completely relativize your entire worldview. As Peter Berger argued way back in the 60s, when absolutely everyone around you believes the exact same thing, your worldview does not feel like a belief choice. It just feels like the objective way things are. but that one skeptical friend can suddenly make your worldview feel less obvious, less certain, and less taken for granted. The researchers also cite a fascinating 2017 study which discovered that peer friendships matter significantly more to shaping the identity of non-religious young people than to religious ones. Therefore, a non-religious friend pulling someone out of religion may actually be a much stronger psychological force than a religious friend holding someone inside the faith. Alright, so far this data perfectly matches the popular cultural story we started with. The religious kid goes off to college, meets the skeptics, and the sacred umbrella starts leaking water fast. But that is not the whole story here. The researchers also looked at these exact same numbers from the opposite direction. Remember, the study found that for a religious teenager with a fully non-religious friend group, their chance of becoming an atheist was 14%. Now, flip that statistic around. If 14% of those kids became atheists, then about 86% of them did not. So, even when entirely surrounded with non-religious friends over the crucial course of 8 developmental years, roughly 6 out of 7 young adults still do not end up as atheists. So, yes, non-religious friends may certainly dial up the statistical odds of adopting non-belief, but that social nudge is relatively small against everything else holding that massive worldview in place. Now, here I do think the study is missing some important, deep nuance. Some of these religious teenagers surely picked up some massive intellectual doubts along the way, or maybe they adopted a brand new identity, like spiritual but not religious, and the study's blunt, 3-option questions simply cannot see that data. Did you believe in God? Yes, no, or unsure. But it is still incredibly interesting that the decisive radical move to flat-out atheism stayed remarkably rare. Because of this, the authors argue that worldviews may not be nearly as fragile as some prior sociological research suggests. Once you are heavily socialized into a particular sacred canopy during childhood, it is incredibly hard to draw you completely out of it, no matter who your college friends happen to be. And this makes perfect sense when you consider what religion actually is on the ground. We modern people tend to focus heavily on belief, defining a religious identity entirely hinging on your mental opinion about whether God exists or not. But a real religious community shapes your entire daily life. It dictates who you hang out with, what your deepest moral values are, where you spend your time on Friday night, Saturday or Sunday morning, the holidays you celebrate, and your core traditions. By the time you reach your teenage years, that sacred umbrella is pretty all-encompassing. In fact, the researchers identified that the single strongest statistical factor protecting a teenager's belief was simply how often they physically attended a religious service. The Christian kids who were sitting in the pews most weeks were the ones who held on tightly. Now, bring in one non-religious friend. They can certainly raise a tough question you had never thought of before. They can show you that a completely different way of living is possible, and that can have a real effect of adopting non-belief. But that one friend is pulling against your parents, your childhood memories, your community, your entire sense of who you are and where you came from. Against all of that weight, a friend or two usually is just not enough. Now, of course, this study is not the absolute final word on the matter. Remember the classic puzzle of selection versus influence. Influence is your friends changing what you believe, and selection is you picking friends who already believe what you do. And as I mentioned, the two can look exactly the same in numbers. You can see someone surrounded by non-religious friends who had lost their religion, but you cannot always tell whether or not the friends did the changing. The longitudinal nature of this study helps a lot because the researchers watched the secular friends come first in 2005, and then the belief change come later in 2013, but it does not completely solve the problem. You can easily picture a teenager who is already having massive internal doubts, but nothing they would dare say out loud to their parents. And that kid might already be naturally drawn to non-religious friends because those friends feel safer, less judgmental, and more comfortable to be around. And that same kid might be the one who is going to leave the faith anyway, regardless of their peers. The authors do not claim to have completely settled this puzzle. What they do say, though, is that their study helps corroborate older, classic studies on religious conversion, how people get pulled into completely different worldviews. And these studies have consistently found that close friendship and social contact always come first, and then the adoption of the new belief system follows. On atheism specifically, one qualitative study found that for some people, meeting new friends and encountering new professors in college directly prompted and drove their questioning of God. The authors beautifully write, "It may be best to think about weakening theistic worldviews, burgeoning atheistic worldviews, and friendships with others who do not believe in God as dynamic processes that may mutually reinforce each other and potentially lead to the adoption of an atheistic worldview. In other words, doubt, friends, and a shifting worldview feed into each other in a continuous cycle. The internal doubt makes the secular friends more appealing. The secular friends make the doubt feel more livable and normal, and then you have a powerful feedback loop. Now, of course, non-belief does not look the same everywhere around the globe. As I mentioned, the study was very American-centric and Christian-centric. So, I would be intensely curious to see these exact same results replicated in other cultures. Like in a lot of Asian countries, non-religion can look radically different. Take Thailand, for example. Something like 90% of that entire country is officially Buddhist, but belief in the Western propositional sense completely misses how a lot of Buddhists in that country actually practice religion. Their religious life focuses heavily on merit-making, sacred rituals, and daily practices woven deeply into ordinary, physical life, rather than declaring an opinion on a creed. In a culture like that, having a non-religious friend might mean something completely different for your identity. It reminds us that worldviews are deeply social, and the umbrellas we stand under are always woven from the culture around us. Thank you for watching. Remember to subscribe, and I will see you next time.